In early 1944, as Allied planners compressed months of operational preparation into the final winter before Operation Overlord, British infantry training establishments encountered a constraint that could not be solved by additional ammunition, longer drills, or stricter discipline. Because it originated at the intersection of human physiology and mechanical timing rather than doctrine. Combat analysis from Tunisia in 1943 and Sicily in July 1943 showed that more than 70% of infantry firefights occurred inside 300 yards, with a majority collapsing below 150 yards, where target exposure times often fell under 2 seconds and sometimes below 1 second once contact was made. A window too short for deliberate sight adjustment on a service rifle designed around graduated precision. The standard infantry weapon, the rifle number 4 MKI, firing the .303 British cartridge with a 174-grain Mk7 projectile at approximately 2,440 feet per second, was capable of mechanical accuracy well beyond 600 yards, but that capability assumed stable posture, measured breathing, and time for sight refinement, conditions that systematically vanished once heart rate exceeded roughly 140 beats per minute and visual focus narrowed under stress. The friction emerged around the rifle's rear sight system, which combined an adjustable ladder graduated to 1,300 yards with a fixed 300-yard aperture, because institutional marksmanship doctrine continued to privilege the ladder as the correct interface for a trained soldier. Despite mounting evidence that the latter imposed an angular alignment task incompatible with snap engagement. The technical limiter was not ballistic drop or dispersion, but alignment time, because the latter aperture demanded conscious centering of rear ring, front post, and target plane, a sequence that consumed critical fractions of a second, during which a fleeting silhouette could vanish behind hedgerow, rubble, or smoke. In contrast, the fixed aperture, when treated as a ghost ring rather than a measuring device, allowed the human visual system to auto-center the front sight through circular symmetry, collapsing the alignment process into a single perceptual action governed by reflex rather than calculation. This practice was initially treated as a shortcut bordering on negligence, because it appeared to discard the precision culture built into British infantry training since the interwar period, where deliberate fire at known distances reinforced confidence in mechanical correctness. Senior non-commissioned officers, many trained under pre-war musketry regulations, dismissed the approach as a pointless rifle hack, arguing that abandoning adjustable sights reduced effective range and undermined fire discipline. A critique that made sense only if engagement geometry remained stable and time was abundant. What those objections failed to account for was the physical irreversibility imposed by reaction latency, because once a target appeared inside 100 yards, the time required to refine elevation or confirm range exceeded the time required for the enemy to fire, turning every additional adjustment into a liability rather than an advantage. By February 1944, internal training memoranda circulated within units earmarked for the British 3rd Infantry Division reflected a subtle but consequential shift, driven by live-fire exercises that simulated snap targets and limited exposure. Because soldiers instructed to leave the rear sight fixed and engage immediately achieved higher first-round hit probability under time pressure than those attempting to dial elevation based on estimated range. The rifle itself did not change, nor did the ammunition or the firing positions, but the firing sequence did, as instructors began emphasizing speed of acceptable alignment over refinement of perfect sight picture, implicitly acknowledging that the engagement was bounded by time to first shot rather than by group size on a static range. This shift was reinforced by the terrain intelligence emerging from Normandy, where bocage fields, sunken lanes, and stone villages imposed hard limits on visibility and engagement distance, often compressing contact ranges below the minimum distances at which ladder graduations provided any practical benefit. The technical constraint here was line-of-sight occlusion, because foliage and earthworks fragmented visual corridors into narrow windows that opened and closed unpredictably, leaving no margin for fine adjustment once a target presented itself. Under those conditions, the rifle sight ceased to function as a range-calibrated instrument and instead became a timing interface, mediating between human perception and ballistic trajectory under severe temporal compression. When British infantry landed on gold and sword beaches in June 1944, these training adaptations encountered combat validation, not as a formal doctrine shift, but as an emergent pattern across platoons moving inland, where rapid engagements against German defensive positions forced soldiers to fire immediately upon contact to suppress movement and deny initiative. The fixed aperture, used without adjustment, enabled faster target acquisition under recoil and fatigue because it reduced the cognitive load required to align sights while advancing through debris-strewn streets and hedgerow gaps, where posture was compromised and breathing irregular. The physical limiter remained exposure time, because every second spent refining aim increased vulnerability to counterfire from concealed positions armed with machine pistols and light machine guns optimized for close-range dominance. German infantry, many equipped with Carabiner 98K rifles featuring open-notch rear sights, faced the same environmental constraints but without the perceptual advantage of an aperture system that supported rapid centering, requiring instead the alignment of rear notch, front post, and target under stress, a task equally vulnerable to neuromuscular degradation, but less forgiving of imperfect focus. This asymmetry did not negate German fire discipline or marksmanship skill, but it altered the microdynamics of contact, where milliseconds accumulated into suppression advantage at the section level, shaping movement and casualty distribution without producing a single decisive moment. As the Normandy campaign progressed into July and August 1944, after-action reports increasingly reflected an implicit understanding that effective infantry fire was governed less by theoretical accuracy than by throughput under constraint, a realization that began to filter back into training revisions without fanfare or new equipment designations. The rifle remained mechanically identical to its pre-war configuration, but the way it was aimed had shifted in response to the immutable limits imposed by human reaction time, terrain occlusion, and ballistic immediacy, setting the stage for a broader reassessment of how infantry weapons interfaced with the soldiers who carried them. That reassessment did not occur through a single directive or doctrinal proclamation, because the British Army in mid-1944 was constrained by operational tempo and casualty replacement cycles that left no margin for wholesale retraining, forcing adaptation to occur at the instructor and unit level where feedback loops were shortest and consequences most immediate. The technical limiter driving this informal evolution was training throughput, because infantry depots were required to process drafts on compressed schedules measured in weeks rather than months, making any method that reduced cognitive load under fire disproportionately valuable. Under these constraints, sight usage that eliminated range estimation and adjustment steps effectively shortened the training pipeline while improving combat relevance, a rare alignment of efficiency and lethality that institutional systems tend to adopt even when cultural resistance persists. Live-fire data collected during July 1944 showed that soldiers engaging pop-up and crossing targets at distances between 50 and 200 yards demonstrated measurably faster engagement cycles when the rear sight remained fixed. Because recoil recovery and sight reacquisition were simplified by the larger effective aperture, which tolerated imperfect cheek weld and inconsistent head position caused by movement, equipment weight, and fatigue. The physical constraint here was recoil impulse management, because the .303 cartridge generated sufficient rearward force to disrupt fine alignment after each shot, and any sighting system that demanded precise repositioning after recoil imposed a time penalty that accumulated over multiple engagements. By reducing alignment sensitivity, the fixed aperture allowed faster re-engagement without requiring the shooter to consciously rebuild the sight picture from first principles. This effect became more pronounced during urban fighting in Normandy towns such as Tilly-sur-Seulles and Caen, where British infantry encountered rapid transitions between open streets and confined interiors, forcing constant shifts in posture and sight line that invalidated preset elevation assumptions. The limiting factor in these environments was posture instability, because firing positions were often improvised, partial, or asymmetrical, with soldiers shooting from doorways, rubble piles, or stairwells where prone stability was impossible. In such conditions, a sighting method that relied on gross alignment rather than fine calibration proved resilient, because it absorbed positional error without collapsing hit probability at combat distances. As reports filtered upward, the language used to describe effective fire began to change subtly, replacing references to correct site setting with phrases emphasizing speed of engagement and immediate response. A semantic shift that reflected an underlying systems understanding rather than a moral judgment about marksmanship quality. The technical anchor here was decision latency, because once contact occurred, the shooter's cognitive bandwidth was consumed by threat identification, movement coordination, and command signals, leaving little capacity for deliberate sight manipulation. Any system that reduced the number of decisions between target detection and shot release effectively increased survivability by compressing the engagement loop. By late summer 1944, this logic began to influence post-operation training assessments, where instructors noted that soldiers trained to treat the aperture as a timing aid rather than a measurement instrument demonstrated greater consistency across variable scenarios, even if their long-range grouping remained inferior on control ranges. The constraint shaping this outcome was environmental variability, because combat conditions introduced unpredictable lighting, partial concealment, and movement that degraded the utility of finely graduated sights calibrated for uniform ranges. Under these conditions, robustness outweighed precision, and the rifle sight shooter system evolved toward configurations that failed gracefully rather than catastrophically when conditions deviated from the ideal. The significance of this adaptation lay not in its novelty, but in its inevitability, because it emerged wherever the same constraints converged, regardless of unit lineage or individual preference, suggesting that the change was not driven by innovation culture, but by physics and physiology asserting dominance over tradition. The so-called hack persisted because it aligned with these constraints, not because it challenged doctrine directly, but because it quietly bypassed it, embedding itself in practice where formal rules could not keep pace with operational reality. That quiet persistence carried consequences beyond the immediate battlefield, because once a method proves resilient under constraint, it tends to propagate through repetition rather than endorsement, embedding itself in institutional muscle memory long before manuals are rewritten. The technical limiter shaping this propagation was feedback delay, because formal doctrine revisions lagged combat experience by months or years, while instructors and platoon leaders received confirmation within hours or days, measured in suppressed enemy movement and reduced friendly exposure. Under those conditions, practices that shortened the engagement loop survived regardless of their doctrinal status, while those that demanded ideal conditions quietly fell out of use. As British formations advanced beyond Normandy into the Low Countries in late 1944, engagement geometry remained compressed by built-up areas, canal crossings, and forested approaches, reinforcing the same constraints that had driven earlier adaptation. The fixed aperture continued to function as a stabilizing interface, not because it was universally superior, but because it reduced sensitivity to error in environments where error was unavoidable. The physical anchor here was visual disruption, because smoke, dust, and low light degraded contrast and depth perception, making fine sight alignment unreliable even for experienced shooters, while a core centering system preserved functional accuracy within the distances that mattered. This pattern did not remain isolated within British forces, because Allied interoperability exposed similar conclusions among American units armed with the M1 Garand, whose rear aperture sight already embodied many of the same principles, reinforcing the idea that aperture-based rapid alignment was not a national peculiarity, but a convergent solution to shared constraints. The limiting factor was standardization pressure, because multinational operations demanded common training assumptions at the platoon and company level, and systems that aligned intuitively across different weapons reduced friction during joint operations. In this context, British acceptance of fixed aperture engagement logic represented not a divergence, but a convergence toward a broader Allied infantry paradigm. Post-war small arms analysis would later frame these changes in terms of ergonomics and human factors. But during 1944, they were understood implicitly as soldiers and instructors observed that effective fire emerged from systems designed around human limits rather than against them. The rifle's mechanical precision remained relevant at longer ranges and in controlled conditions, but within the dominant engagement envelope imposed by modern terrain and tactics. The decisive variable was how quickly a shooter could produce a usable sight picture under stress. The technical constraint here was motor degradation, because fine motor skills deteriorated predictably under combat stress, leaving gross alignment as the most reliable input channel available. As these insights accumulated, they began to influence not just sight usage, but broader training emphasis, shifting focus toward immediate engagement drills, movement under fire, and coordination at the section level, where rapid suppression mattered more than individual marksmanship accolades. The rifle hack, once dismissed as careless, became an unspoken assumption embedded in training tempo and evaluation criteria, shaping how soldiers were prepared without ever being formally celebrated. Its endurance illustrated a recurring pattern in military systems, where adaptations driven by constraint outlast those driven by intention, because they are reinforced continuously by operational reality rather than by policy. By the end of 1944, the British infantry rifleman carried the same weapon he had trained with earlier in the war, but the way he interacted with it had shifted in response to forces that no amount of institutional inertia could resist, setting a precedent for post-war small arms development that would increasingly prioritize speed, robustness, and human-centered design over theoretical maximum performance. That precedent did not crystallize immediately into equipment change, because wartime production priorities and standardization froze weapon configurations in place, forcing adaptation to occur almost entirely at the interface between soldier and system rather than in steel or machining tolerances. The technical limiter at this stage was manufacturing inertia, because retooling rear sight assemblies or issuing revised components across millions of rifles during an active campaign was infeasible without disrupting supply chains already stretched by ammunition, spares, and replacement barrels. As a result, the only adjustable variable left was behavior, and behavior changed precisely because it required no material intervention to align with observed constraints. Training pamphlets compiled in late 1944 began to reflect this reality obliquely, emphasizing rapid engagement drills, immediate fire upon contact, and reduced emphasis on range estimation under 300 yards. Not as a repudiation of marksmanship, but as a recalibration of priorities dictated by combat geometry. The physical anchor here was engagement density, because infantry actions increasingly involved overlapping fields of fire at short range where suppression, not precision, governed movement, and where the ability to place rounds quickly into an area of threat mattered more than point accuracy against a single exposed target. Under these conditions, a sighting method that tolerated error without collapsing effectiveness functioned as a force multiplier, even though it remained officially unremarkable. This recalibration also altered how instructors evaluated performance, shifting attention from tight grouping on known distance ranges to consistency across variable scenarios, including movement, partial cover, and degraded visibility. The constraint driving this shift was evaluative relevance, because training metrics that did not correlate with survival or mission success under fire gradually lost credibility among those responsible for preparing replacements. The fixed aperture method survived this scrutiny because it produced repeatable results across conditions that could not be standardized, reinforcing its legitimacy without requiring formal endorsement. As winter operations in Northwest Europe introduced additional variables such as rain, mud, and reduced daylight, the advantages of simplified sight alignment became more pronounced because environmental degradation further eroded the viability of fine adjustments. The technical limiter here was environmental interference, because moisture, debris, and low contrast degraded sight clarity and increased the likelihood of misalignment, while a course centering approach remained functional even when visual cues were partially obscured. In this sense, the so-called hack functioned as a robustness upgrade, trading marginal theoretical precision for resilience against inevitable degradation. These observations began to influence post-war analytical frameworks almost by default, because when ordnance engineers and training officers reviewed wartime data, they encountered a consistent pattern linking engagement success to speed and robustness rather than to maximal accuracy potential. The constraint shaping this retrospective understanding was data aggregation, because individual anecdotes carried limited weight, but repeated outcomes across theaters and units formed a statistical gravity that pulled conclusions toward human-centered design. Aperture sights, simplified controls, and reduced adjustment steps increasingly appeared not as compromises, but as rational responses to measured limits. The change, therefore, was not a story of invention, but of alignment, where existing components were reinterpreted through the lens of operational constraint until their latent advantages became obvious in practice. The rifle hack did not alter ballistics, metallurgy, or doctrine in isolation, but it redefined the relationship between them by acknowledging that the decisive factor in infantry combat was often the narrow interval between detection and response. An interval governed by physiology and perception rather than by tables or graduations. As these insights settled into institutional memory, they formed a quiet foundation upon which later small arms philosophies would build, privileging systems that worked with the shooter's limitations instead of against them, and ensuring that the lessons paid for in 1944 were not entirely lost once the war moved on to new theaters and new technologies. That foundation mattered because it reshaped how limitations were interpreted, turning them from defects to design parameters, a shift that altered the internal logic of infantry weapons thinking even before new models appeared. The technical limiter governing this reinterpretation was engagement tempo, because wartime analysis increasingly showed that the decisive variable in small unit combat was not maximum effective range, but the rate at which a section could impose immediate fire on a newly detected threat. Once that rate became the dominant measure, any feature that slowed the first shot or the first corrective shot lost value regardless of its theoretical contribution to long-range accuracy. This logic surfaced repeatedly in late 1944 debriefs, where commanders noted that infantry sections able to establish rapid, overlapping fire gained freedom of movement even when individual shots were not perfectly placed, because suppression operated through probability density rather than precision. The physical constraint here was exposure geometry, because enemy soldiers rarely presented full silhouettes, instead offering fragments of movement through gaps, windows, and foliage, making perfect alignment unattainable while still allowing acceptable hits if rounds were delivered quickly into the threat zone. Under these conditions, a sighting method optimized for speed effectively expanded the usable target area without requiring conscious recalibration. The same reasoning began to influence how replacement troops were integrated into frontline units, because simplified aiming practices reduced the performance gap between veterans and newcomers, compressing the time required for effective participation in combat. The technical anchor was skill decay under stress, because even experienced shooters experienced degradation when fatigued, wounded, or operating under continuous threat, narrowing the practical difference between high skill and moderate skill performance. A system that minimized reliance on fine motor control preserved effectiveness across that spectrum, stabilizing unit performance despite personnel turnover. By early 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and fought through increasingly complex urban environments, the value of rapid engagement over refined precision became even more pronounced, because combat unfolded inside buildings, courtyards, and rubble-filled streets where distances collapsed and angles multiplied. The limiting factor in these environments was spatial compression, because targets appeared suddenly at close range, often from elevated or offset positions that invalidated any preconception of range or elevation. In such spaces, the rifle sight functioned less as a ballistic calculator and more as a directional index, guiding fire instinctively towards center mass under extreme time pressure. Although the original controversy over the so-called pointless rifle hack had faded by this stage, replaced by routine practice, its influence persisted in how soldiers thought about their weapons, privileging immediate usability over theoretical capability. The constraint shaping this persistence was cognitive economy, because combat demanded that soldiers conserve mental resources for movement, communication, and situational awareness, leaving aiming to operate as automatically as possible. Any system that reduced conscious processing at the moment of engagement freed capacity elsewhere, indirectly improving overall combat effectiveness. This accumulation of practice-based knowledge did not produce a single doctrinal breakpoint, but it established a pattern that future analysts could trace backward. Recognizing that the evolution of infantry aiming during 1944 was less about innovation than about surrendering to limits that had always been present but previously ignored. The rifle hack endured because it acknowledged those limits openly, embedding them into behavior rather than attempting to overcome them through training alone, a choice that proved durable precisely because it was constrained by reality rather than by aspiration. That durability revealed a deeper systemic effect, because once infantry training accepts constraint as a governing variable, it begins to reorganize priorities across the entire engagement chain, from weapon handling to command rhythm. The technical limiter shaping this reorganization was communication delay, because small unit leaders discovered that rapid, unsighted, or minimally sighted fire stabilized situations faster than verbal control could, allowing orders to follow suppression rather than attempt to precede it. When sections could generate immediate fire upon contact, the commander's role shifted from initiating response to shaping movement within an already suppressed space, a reversal that depended on the rifle's ability to deliver usable fire without preparatory adjustment. This altered relationship between fire and command was evident in late-war British infantry drills, where emphasis increasingly fell on immediate action rather than perfect execution, reflecting an understanding that initiative at the micro level was constrained by physics rather than hierarchy. The physical anchor here was auditory overload, because battlefield noise from artillery, small arms, and vehicles degraded verbal communication, making reliance on shouted commands unreliable at the moment of contact. Under these conditions, the rifle's role as an autonomous response mechanism grew, and sighting methods that enabled rapid, instinctive fire supported that autonomy by reducing dependence on instruction. The implications extended into how fire superiority was conceptualized, shifting from sustained, carefully regulated fire to short bursts of immediate engagement designed to seize the temporal advantage. The technical limiter governing this shift was ammunition expenditure rate, because rapid engagement methods risked higher consumption, forcing leaders to balance speed against resupply constraints. However, combat reports indicated that faster suppression often reduced overall ammunition usage by shortening engagements, an outcome that inverted pre-war assumptions and reinforced the value of rapid sight acquisition despite its apparent inefficiency on paper. This inversion became visible in how soldiers described their own experiences, often noting that fights resolved themselves quickly once one side established immediate pressure, while prolonged exchanges usually followed hesitation or delayed response. The constraint here was momentum decay, because once initiative was lost in the opening seconds, regaining it required disproportionate effort and risk. A sighting method that minimized hesitation, therefore, had effects beyond individual hits, influencing the entire temporal shape of an engagement. As these patterns repeated across operations, the rifle hack's influence began to appear less as an exception and more as an expression of a general principle, where systems optimized for human limitations outperformed those optimized for idealized conditions. The technical anchor supporting this principle was error tolerance, because any combat system that collapsed under minor deviation proved brittle, while those that absorbed error maintained function across a wider range of states. The fixed aperture approach exemplified this tolerance, sustaining effectiveness even when posture, lighting, and stress degraded ideal alignment. By the final months of the European campaign, the British infantryman's relationship with his rifle reflected this convergence, not through explicit doctrine, but through habitual use, where the sight was treated as a guide rather than a gauge, and speed was treated as a form of accuracy within constrained space and time. This habit, once established, proved resistant to reversal because it aligned with lived experience rather than instruction, ensuring that the lessons embedded in 1944 would continue to influence practice long after the immediate circumstances that revealed them had passed. That resistance to reversal mattered because habits formed under fire tend to define baseline expectations, shaping how soldiers evaluate new equipment and training long after the original context fades. The technical limiter governing this inertia was learning consolidation, because behaviors repeatedly reinforced under stress become default responses that are difficult to overwrite without equally intense counter-experience. Once the fixed aperture, rapid alignment method proved reliable in dozens of engagements, it established itself as the baseline against which any alternative was measured, not in theory, but in remembered survival margins measured in seconds. This baseline quietly influenced post-campaign assessments conducted by British ordnance and training staffs, who found that recommendations emphasizing simplicity, visibility, and rapid alignment resonated more strongly with frontline feedback than proposals focused on extended range precision. The physical constraint anchoring these assessments was engagement probability distribution, because statistical review showed that the overwhelming majority of infantry contacts occurred within distances where simplified aiming delivered acceptable ballistic performance, while the minority of long-range opportunities rarely justified the time and exposure required to exploit adjustable sights. Under such distributions, optimizing for the median case produced better overall outcomes than preserving capability for rare extremes. The same logic affected how soldiers evaluated their own effectiveness, because confidence increasingly derived from the ability to respond immediately rather than from mastery of fine adjustment procedures. The technical anchor here was confidence decay under uncertainty, because hesitation introduced by complex sight manipulation eroded trust in one's own response, while a simple, repeatable method preserved decisiveness even when conditions were ambiguous. This psychological stability translated directly into faster action, reinforcing the cycle that favored speed-oriented sight usage. As Allied forces transitioned toward occupation duties in late 1945, these habits did not disappear because training cadres drawn from combat veterans carried their assumptions forward into peacetime instruction, often emphasizing rapid engagement fundamentals even when teaching on static ranges. The limiter shaping this transmission was instructor bias, because those who had survived under constraint naturally privileged methods that had proven resilient, regardless of whether official manuals fully reflected those priorities. In this way, the rifle hack propagated across cohorts without formal endorsement, embedded in tone, emphasis, and drill selection rather than an explicit regulation. Over time, this quiet inheritance influenced how future infantry weapons were judged during trials and evaluations, because features that supported rapid alignment and error tolerance were intuitively favored by those with combat experience, even when competing designs offered superior theoretical precision. The physical constraint underlying these judgments remained unchanged. The human shooter under stress could not reliably exploit maximal mechanical accuracy, making systems that demanded such exploitation inherently fragile. Designs that acknowledged this constraint, whether intentionally or not, align more closely with the lived reality of infantry combat. The episode from 1944 thus functioned less as a discrete lesson than as an inflection point, where accumulated evidence forced a re-evaluation of what accuracy meant in practice, redefining it as a balance between speed, robustness, and acceptable dispersion within constrained space and time. That re-evaluation did not conclude with the war's end, because the conditions that produced it, human physiology, perceptual limits, and environmental unpredictability, remained constant, ensuring that the underlying logic would resurface whenever infantry weapons were tested against reality rather than against range tables. The significance of what unfolded in 1944 only becomes clear when viewed against the longer arc of infantry warfare, because the so-called pointless rifle hack was not an isolated adjustment, but an early manifestation of a broader realignment between weapon systems and the immutable constraints of human performance. For decades before the war, small arms development had been driven by the pursuit of extended range and mechanical precision, assumptions inherited from open field engagements and reinforced by range-based training metrics. Even as the battlefield itself was becoming increasingly fragmented, faster, and more compressive, Normandy exposed that mismatch with unusual clarity, because its terrain, tempo, and casualty rates stripped away theoretical margins and forced every system to operate inside its narrowest functional envelope. Where seconds mattered more than graduations and survivability depended on immediate response rather than on optimal conditions. What changed in 1944 was not the rifle, the cartridge, or even the formal doctrine, but the implicit definition of accuracy itself, which shifted from static measurement of dispersion to a dynamic function of time, stress, and probability. The British infantryman using the number 4 MK did not suddenly become a better marksman in laboratory terms, but he became a more effective combat system component because his weapon interface was adapted to how the human eye, nervous system, and musculature actually behaved under fire. That adaptation aligned practice with reality, acknowledging that under combat stress, fine motor precision collapses, perceptual narrowing occurs, and decision windows shrink below the threshold at which deliberate optimization remains viable. Once those constraints were accepted rather than resisted, the entire engagement loop shortened, and lethality increased without any change in metallurgy or ballistics. In historical context, this episode sits alongside other wartime adjustments that followed the same pattern, where systems evolved not through breakthrough invention, but through the surrender of idealized assumptions, whether in armored warfare, air combat, or naval operations. In each case, effectiveness improved when design and doctrine converged toward what could be sustained under pressure rather than what could be achieved under ideal conditions. The rifle sight adjustment of 1944 belongs to that category, because it demonstrated that small, behavior-driven changes could have disproportionate effects when they reduced friction at critical moments, especially in environments dominated by uncertainty and compressed timescales. The long-term impact of this realization extended into the post-war period, influencing how future infantry weapons were conceived, evaluated, and taught, even when the connection to its wartime origin faded from memory. Aperture sights, simplified controls, and engagement-focused training philosophies did not emerge solely because technology advanced, but because 1944 had already established a precedent. Systems that respected human limits outperformed those that demanded humans rise above them. That lesson endured because it was validated repeatedly under fire, making it resistant to theoretical reversal and ensuring its quiet transmission across generations of soldiers and designers. Seen from this perspective, the rifle hack was never truly pointless, nor was it revolutionary in isolation. It was an inevitable correction imposed by the physics of time, perception, and terrain revealed during a campaign where those forces could no longer be ignored. Its legacy lies not in the specific sight setting used by British infantry in Normandy, but in the broader recognition that in modern war, effectiveness is rarely the product of perfect solutions, and more often the result of systems that continue to function when perfection becomes impossible.